Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another one of my GaudiumEtSpiz22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube videos. Still suffering from the lingering effects of a stupid lung infection, although I'm about 90% better. But with all the talking and chatting, I might end up with another coughing fit. So just bear with me, especially those of you who are just listening. Also, just want to remind people that the Gaudium et Spes 22 and Dorothy Day Catholic Worker Farm fundraiser are still in effect. We've actually made about $6,000 of our $29,000 goal. So that's great. We're ahead of the game. So thank you to everybody who donated. Anyway, enough of that. I'm very excited today. I have a return, yes, a return guest. Jonathan's been on the show before. Dr. Jonathan Ciraulo, welcome to the show today.
Thanks. Great pleasure to be here.
I'm just, so damn jealous of your big shock of hair. It's just, I'm almost ready just to pull the plug on this whole interview out of rage and jealousy over the hair. I too
The
once had hair. I too once had hair. So,
the jealousy is mutual, Larry. If all could be as I am, the bald look is a charming look, Larry. I don't think I could pull it off. Who knows what
oh,
deformities I hold
well,
underneath.
you probably, from the looks of things, you're not going to have to pull it off. So anyway, for those of you who don't know, Dr. Ciraulo, Dr. Jonathan Ciraulo, I first met him. He was a professor of theology at St. Meinrad Seminary out in Indiana, but he is now associate professor of theology at the Catholic University of America, which is fantastic. I also want to remind readers, the last time I had him on, we discussed his wonderful book, and I'm going to recommend it again, the Eucharistic Form of God, Hans Urs von Balthasar's Sacramental Theology. And for those of you viewing, I'll just hold it up. It's actually a really beautiful cover. Nice hardcover book, The Eucharistic Form of God, Hans Urs von Balthasar's Sacramental Theology. It's really a brilliant book, one that I learned as a Balthasarian, even. Somebody who's devoted his whole life to reading and studying Balthasar. I learned a lot from reading this book, so I do highly recommend it to people. But what I also want to discuss today, and this is the main thing we want to discuss, is that Dr. Ciraulo is, in fact, one of the editors, one of the main editors of the new Ressourcement Journal, which is published by Word on Fire, started by Bishop Barron and Word on Fire. And the new Ressourcement movement has now had two conferences. I was at one last fall, and there was another one this fall. Uh, Out in Rochester, Minnesota, where Bishop Barron is stationed. And the one I attended last year was really magnificent. But anyway, so I wanted there's a couple of things I wanted to discuss with Dr. Ciraulo today that would probably be of interest to many of my viewers. First thing I want to discuss is what is ressourcement theology, which, is an open, everybody sort of thinks they know what it is, but we need to maybe discuss it. And then why a new journal on ressourcement theology? Why start a journal called the New Ressourcement, especially since I'm on the editorial board of another journal devoted to ressourcement theology, if you want to, Communio, International Catholic Review. And I've had a lot of people email me and say, well, why do we need something other than Communio? I think we do. And I think they're complementary, but we can discuss that. So anyway, thanks, Jonathan, for coming on the show today. So let's begin with that first question. Very open-ended. You can answer it in any way, shape, or form. You can approach it any way you want. But what, in your mind, what is the essence of ressourcement theology? What exactly is it?
Yeah, it's a complex question, right? You can answer it kind of historically. How did it come about? Who's associated with it? Um, as is well known, Charles Peguy, the great poet, comes up with the term, right? As poets are wont to
Yes.
do, to sort of break open language to come up with a new concept, ressourcement, right? To go back to the sources. So it's originally a kind of poetic term for him, and you can imagine why a poet would be attracted to not looking at simply the phenomena as they appear, but all the way in their roots, right? To go back to the heart of the matter. But of course, it becomes kind of a rallying cry for this group of theologians loosely associated in the early 20th century. Henri de Lubac, Danielou, Balthasar, who are finding an attraction to particularly the church fathers, both Latin and Greek. Right, so typically, if you think ressourcement theology, you think de Lubac, you think the source chrétienne, you think of these new editions of the church fathers, you think of Balthazar's Presence in Thought, his book on Maximus, his book on Gregory of Nyssa. And you could say what's kind of revolutionary about that in a way is a move away from theology simply as a system of propositions. And of course, that's not a totally fair characterization of neo-scholasticism. But it is a move to say not simply Augustine as distilled through Aquinas and then later distilled into manuals, but sort of the rambling Augustine of the Confessions, right? Sort of, right? Because it is,
Yeah.
right? It's poetic. It's written by people who have a certain kind of pathos, right? So it's irreducible to a system, at least not easily so. And what they're seeing in these figures is kind of a way to reinvigorate theological thought, philosophical thought, right? In particular, to meet the demands of modernity, right? The kind of
Yes.
questions that are being asked, the range, right? I think if any way you could describe it is that theology felt itself, whether rightly or wrongly, to be more cramped than the philosophical versions on offer. Right, so could Catholic theology be as expansive, if not more expansive, than the thought of a Heidegger or a Hegel or a Spinoza?
Yeah, very good. Uh, and so obviously, ressourcement, French term, a return to the sources, in this case, a greater focus on scripture and the church fathers and so on. But I want to focus in, obviously, and like you said, you can approach it historically. One could even go back and say there are proto-ressourcement guys like Matthias Scheeben in the 19th century and other thinkers. Maybe even Cardinal Newman was a kind of proto
Oh,
uh,
absolutely. Yeah.
ressourcement thinker, obviously, because he was very immersed in the church fathers. And yet it does come to be, historically speaking, associated with folks like Danielou and de Lubac, the French Jesuits. And so historically, it seemed at first to be a kind of, it seems to me, a dispute almost, a dispute between French schools of thought, a dispute between French Jesuits and, say, French Dominicans, a dispute between Henri de Lubac and Garrigou-Lagrange, and which boils down to as well a dispute between different kinds of French politics, Action Française versus Catholic action, uh, sort of integralist monarchist tendencies versus more modern approaches to the question of religion in political life. Uh, all of that gets sort of, from my point of view, from just a strictly historical point of view, thrown into the mix. But that can kind of muddy the waters too, it seems to me. One can get bogged down in personalities. One can get bogged down in the politics and various historical permutations and so on. But what would then you identify as the central? You said that the theologians maybe wanted to be more expansive philosophically than Heidegger. Let's out Kant. Let's out Heidegger. Let's out Fichte, and so on and so on. Uh, and yet, what were the burning issues? What were the neuralgic points that the ressourcement thinkers maybe wanted to zero in on that the neo-scholastics kind of were they were taking a more hands-off approach to those questions.
Yeah, in some ways, if you really had to narrow down to the the most local kind of level and historical, it would be what do you do in the wake of the modernist crisis? Right?
Yeah,
Modernism is kind of defeated at an ecclesiastical level, but the problems and the questions of modernism are not really answered, right? And you could say really it's a question about historical consciousness, right? So yes, you can distill a certain set of propositions and ideas from Augustine, from Aquinas, and abstract them. But to what extent is that thought kind of coterminous with the historical situation in which it arose? Right? The modernists would say entirely, right? Thomas says what he says because he's a 13th century Dominican. And you would too if you were a 13th century Dominican. But we, as moderns, simply we have new vocabulary, new kind of content, new metaphors that so therefore we need to kind of infinitely adapt.
Yeah.
Um, the rejection of that is to say no, theology is always and everywhere kind of a stable superstructure. Okay, you could say this is
Yes.
how Blondel critiques the critique of modernism as a kind of extrinsicism. The doctrine kind of floats above history and is always and everywhere true. So transubstantiation is always and everywhere true. It's just that it wasn't revealed to the masses until the word was invented in the 11th, 12th century. Right, so it's not able to account for how you go from more primitive or earlier notions to later ones.
Yeah.
Right, so the ressourcement is in some ways attempting to complete, to do what the modernists try to do, which is attend to historical consciousness, while also believing in the kind of enduring relevance of doctrine. Right, so just because the idea of transubstantiation or homoousios emerges at this point and no other does not mean it's therefore fungible, which is what the modernists would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Guys like Terrell, Loisy, Matthew Minard sent me a wonderful article on Terrell that he had written that is really wonderful. And one of the things that you just said resonates with something that Matthew said to me as well, Matthew Minard, which is that, in many ways, the modernists were raising appropriate questions. The modernists were raising the question of historical consciousness, the dynamism of human history, uh, and what is the relationship between revelation and the dynamism of the history, but also the modernists were raising the issue of human subjectivity. I mean, after all, I mean, it's cliche at this point, starting with Descartes, you get this so-called turn to the subject or whatever. And Rahner has famously attempted to deal with, the transcendental implications of all of that. And so something you just said really strikes me as really, really important to the Ressourcement project and why it's still why Ressourcement is still of ongoing significance. And it is that the fundamental issues raised by the modernists, many of the modernist propositions, as they came to be viewed as associated, were condemned in Pius X's syllabus of errors. But that doesn't mean that the issues that modernism raised were adequately dealt with by the church. Not really, right?
No, certainly not, right? You can simply say, for instance, no, you should not do kind of historical critical method on the New Testament or on the Old Testament.
Yeah.
But you still have the question of how do these texts arise? Are they edited, right? What about this sort of ending to this gospel, right? What about the kind of textual criticism? For example, that's one example of a kind of a lingering question that you could say the academy has answers to, and the church refuses to have an answer to, other than by way of refusal.
Yeah. And so a lot of those issues revolve around uh, what what is the relationship between revelation and ongoing historical development? Uh, Even because, Jonathan, I mean, as you well know, I mean, even the neo-scholastics would acknowledge that there is this thing called a development of doctrine, and beyond a development of doctrine, there's been a development of theology. It's impossible even for a neo-scholastic to look back at the history of theology and say, no, no, everything that we now believe theologically and dogmatically in our various manuals, we can already find in the scriptures, we can already find in Irenaeus and, Ignatius of Antioch and people like this. And it's simply not true. Even they would acknowledge the parable of the mustard seed, that, what Christ planted, it starts as now this gigantic, shrub. And so it seems to me that, however, that something the neo-scholastics did not engage in, that the Ressourcement guys want to do, is to develop theories of development of doctrine, right? How is it? I mean, isn't this really kind of Newman's obsession, right? That how is it the church can seem to have changed so much and yet actually has changed? not at all or so little in any real substantive way. I mean, it's the problem in many ways of the one and the many. It just opens up so many things, right? The concept of the development of doctrine. So how tied is the Ressourcement movement then to this concept of a hermeneutic of how doctrine develops?
No, I think it's absolutely key, right? Blondel is kind of the major philosophical driver of it in his History and Dogma. Gets taken up particularly by Congar, Yves Congar, in his
Yes,
Tradition and Traditions, is very Blondelian. But you're right, of course, anyone today, a scholastic, a more kind of neo-Thomist, agrees that of course you have such a thing as development, right? You can locate historically when a term arises, right? You can see how history develops in a certain way. And just a note, we'll come back to the journal, but we do want this journal to kind of avoid the kind of mudslinging between communio
right.
and Thomistic kind of thinkers. We want, because as you know, our senior editor is Matthew Levering, who's a great Thomist theologian. So this is meant to be a kind of rapprochement between different competing schools, but we can come back to that in a moment.
Yes.
One way that I said that in an article once, one view of development, I call it accumulationism. I think I coined the term, I'm not sure, where it's a
I
view of
like that
development.
term.
It's nice. Yeah. It's whereby
Yeah,
development occurs simply by addition, always by way of addition. Okay, so you go from Christ as God and man to specification of homoousios, to specification of diotheletism, so further additions, so new questions are proposed, new answers are given. So you are always moving from fewer answers to more answers. Right? So the progress of history is simply, if a new question arises, we have the competent authorities to answer such a question. Okay.
right.
Actually, it's actually Karl Rahner who very nicely says, I forget exactly where it is, that sometimes development occurs by way of subtraction. Right? You think of the most kind of easy example would be something like limbo, things that clearly appear for a reason, for a purpose, but sometimes for theology to go forward, it has to do some pruning. Right. And
Yeah,
you'd say that's maybe what the Ressourcement theologians, Balthasar for sure, are after, is not simply to discount the wonderful array of theology from scholasticism, which branches out into every minute topic.
right.
I ask, how again do you relate all these little questions into the one thing necessary, that one central concern, which is, as Vatican II says, right, Christ himself incarnate. Right? Revelation is not simply those documents or witnesses to revelation,
That's
but
right.
revelation is the person of Christ. Right? So in some ways, it's not simply by way of accumulating answers, but simply re having a new witness to that one central revelation, which is Christ himself, which is always going to be, so you could say, faithful to that past tradition, but also measuring that past tradition against revelation itself, which is Christ.
Yeah, I mean, in that regard, Vatican II does emerge very much as a ressourcement council, especially I would say, and my friend Father Robert Imbelli makes this point in Dei Verbum,
Yeah.
the document on Revelation, where Revelation is treated not so much as simply a gnoseological set of little truth nuggets, little propositions. Revelation is not, in a sense, to be reduced to these little propositions. Although the proposition elements of dogma are, of course, important. We're not arguing for uh, a non-dogmatic form of religion. Nevertheless, Dei Verbum emphasizes that ultimately revelation is Christ, and doctrines are second order realities that are expositions of extrapolations of this fundamental revelation of God in Christ. And that's why, Dei Verbum, really goes out of its way to make this point, that revelation is ultimately this revelation of this fantastic mystery.
Absolutely. And the critique is, this is an improvement upon so-called Denzinger theology. The
Right.
funny thing is I love Denzinger. I use it all the time. In
I do
fact,
too.
when I taught at the
It's
seminary,
indispensable.
it's indispensable. Of course, there's better historical documents for each of those texts contained in it, but as a collection, it's a great resource. And ironically, I made my seminarians buy it and read it and use it all the time. Um, Anyways, the critique of so-called Denzinger theology, right, is to reduce all of Catholic doctrine to this one collection of the most important things. Of course, not recognizing that the selection of what you put in the Denzinger is itself a theological judgment, right? That it can be sort
Right.
of argued with. Um, anyways, that's one, right? That's one major issue here. Nicholas of Cusa has this really nice metaphor that the relationship between the mind and truth is the relationship between a polygon and a circle. Right? So no matter how many sides you add to a polygon, it never resolves itself into a circle. There's something like an infinite qualitative difference between polygons and circles.
Yeah.
You can be more or less adequate to a circle. A polygon can be more circular than not, right? And so the mind, of course, our doctrines, our theology should be more circular rather than square, as it is. But there's always going to be a difference between the polygon, which is what a doctrine is, which is what theology is, and the truth it's attesting to, which is the circle.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, it's in no way a denigration of the importance of dogmas or creeds or propositional truths. Uh, but what's important to me too, Jonathan, is it's not just that doctrines are to be embedded within this broader context that God's revelation in Christ. And to avoid a certain reductionism. Very few people actually did that. Very few people. I mean, it's a caricature of the neo-scholastics to say maybe there was a certain hyper Suarezianism where dogmas I mean, revelation was reduced to this set of dogmatic propositions. But very few people actually did that. In reality, when you read a Balthazar who says, his days as a Jesuit scholastic, he was like languishing in the desert of neo-scholasticism, he called it. And de Lubac said similar things. All the Ressourcement guys said similar things. To me, it's not so much that they were saying, hey, scholasticism stinks, it's awful, it's horrible, let's just get rid of this whole edifice. I think there was a certain straitjacket quality to it. And so when I hear Denzinger theology, the thing in my mind, the legitimacy of the pejorative reading of that, oh, that's just Denzinger theology, is that the quoting of dogmas, the quoting of certain propositions was used as a conversation stopper. In other words, not only was a tendency to reduce revelation to a set of propositions, there was a tendency to equate only a very few interpretations of what those dogmas meant as viable, and that anything that dared expand our understanding of a particular dogma ran afoul of what they thought was orthodoxy. That seems to me to be a lot. There's this essence among so many early Ressourcement guys where it's like that straitjacket quality that they were rebelling against.
Yeah, that's exactly right. A metaphor that just came into my head. We'll see if it works. I'll play it out with you. Is
Yeah,
in some ways what a Balthazar, de Lubac are. So think of say revelation or theology as learning a language, which it very much is. The genius of scholasticism or the scholastic method, or let's just say more concretely, seminaries in the 1940s, okay, is that it's teaching you the grammar and vocabulary of this foreign language. And to do it, it's starting from the basics, right? One
yeah,
God, three persons, true natures in Christ, etc. Right? And you sort of memorize and learn the nuts and bolts, right? You pick up the vocabulary, you learn the grammatical rules. And in some ways, and frankly, I say this as a former seminary professor, I guess I still teach seminarians here at CUA. Um, some seminarians, that's all seminarians need that, and some that's all they will ever get, right? They're not as intellectually gifted, so they certainly need this kind of structure
yeah,
of question and answer. Okay. In some ways, what Balthazar and de Lubac are realizing is that actually you can learn a language a lot better by skipping the grammar books and going and living in the foreign country, right? So I could sit here,
yeah,
you and I could open Duolingo and, peck away at that or open a book and learn some Chinese grammar, or we could just move to Beijing, right? And of course,
yes,
who's going to learn it better, more intuitively from the interior is being on the streets of Beijing rather than sort of memorizing forms and charts. It's not to say the charts and the forms aren't true. Of course they're true, but they get played out in a real live way in a foreign country. So going back to the fathers, to scripture, is to try to see revelation, you could say, at its freshest, at its origin, before you could say this later act of putting it into a system, which is all true and necessary, comes about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a beautiful analogy. I like how, the best way to learn a language is to immerse yourself in the language in a total immersion sort of situation. I mean, that's how I learned Spanish. Back when I was a seminarian, I didn't learn it by taking Spanish in a classroom. I learned it because my diocese tossed me into the Dominican Republic, which doesn't have a whole lot of English speakers. At least it didn't back then. It was sink or swim. I either had to learn Spanish or I was going to be unable to communicate with anybody for the entire time I was there. And by God, by the time I was done, I was speaking fluent Spanish.
There you go.
I can't do it anymore, but I did then. So I think that's absolutely true. On the other hand, there comes a time when you do need to turn back to the grammar.
Yes.
You know, even little kids who their first language is English eventually need to take courses in spelling and grammar and so forth in school in order to understand better the rules of language that they know connaturally, but now need to know perhaps with greater grammatical specificity. So the reason why I bring that up is this, that years and years and years ago, and how many years I can remember, 20 years ago, Rusty Reno, great guy. I love Rusty. Editor, chief editor at First Things, successor to later successor to Richard Newhouse, not the immediate one, but later. Wrote a famous essay in First Things. I can't remember the name of it now, but the gist of it was that he called the Ressourcement theologians like Ratzinger, de Lubac, these guys. He called them the greatest generation, that analogy with sort of the World War II generation of Americans that fought the war and so forth. We call them the greatest generation. Well, Reno called those theologians the greatest generation. But he said something very interesting, which has always kind of haunted me just a bit, where he said that as great as those theologians were, part of the post-conciliar crisis that ensued was the fact that they did help to destroy a certain standard theology, a standard church theology that scholasticism had provided. And that the genius of the Ressourcement guys themselves depended upon really a prior immersion in an understanding of the scholastic framework. In other words, even to understand a Balthasar or a de Lubac, you needed to understand the scholastic world out of which they emerged. So Reno's point was we sort of need to resurrect the scholastic model in order to reintroduce a kind of standard theology into the church, in order to, in a sense, have a greater appreciation of the Ressourcement project. Now, I'm not certain I agree with Reno. Maybe I'm even mischaracterizing some of his argument, but I'm pretty confident that's the gist of it. And I don't know if you remember that particular essay or not. But what do you think of that? Because it's a critique that comes up not just from Reno, but from others.
So I do know the article, and there's something obviously true about it, just kind of historically speaking, right? You have these are kind of singular personalities that show up on the scene. And we're seeing today, if you think of where are our Balthazars and Dulubacs, they're either dead
Yeah.
or they're soon to die, right?
Yeah.
It's not clear, and it's not clear who will replace them, right, on that kind of intellectual level. Um, Let me come back to it in a second because I like that you push the metaphor because I think we can play with it a little more, right? If the temptation of the ressourcement theologians is to go off into the far country, as it were, to learn the foreign language, the danger is they're never if they might get some of the grammar wrong, right? They might be prone to certain mistakes they never get corrected because they can communicate, right? So there's a kind of salutary effect by being in dialogue with the Thomist,
Right.
who
Or
can
if I may
provide that.
interrupt for a second, those to whom the Ressourcement guys are teaching, even though the
Sure.
Ressourcement guys may have learned the grammar and then immersed themselves abroad, those they are teaching did not do that same process. So anyway, I'm sorry I
Sure.
interrupted you.
Oh, it's a good point. And vice versa, right? Those who learn simply the grammar and memorize the vocabulary,
Yeah.
could learn a thing or two from learning how, Chinese is actually spoken, the dialects, right? The kind of
Yeah.
local slang that you're not picking up from the grammar, right? The way that you actually pronounce it rather than the way the textbook says to, right? As you know, learning Spanish, the textbook is going to say you must use vosotros. You don't use vosotros in South America,
No.
right? So the local flavors. Okay, anyway, just to
Yeah.
play with the metaphor. And again,
Well, the
that's
first time I heard someone say Benaka, I thought, what the heck is then
yeah,
a key? That's a strange way of saying, come here.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. And so that's something we're trying to do with the journal because in some ways I would hope there'd be more schools of thought than simply Balthasarians and Thomists. But the matter of fact is those you could say are the two dominant strands in American Catholic theology.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's what we have. Great. I wish we have, the Franciscans, could develop something in the school, and they do have one, of course, and many others, Scotus, Bonaventurians, etc. Um, but with these two that we do have, we would hope the journal to be a place where we can have this fruitful interaction. Yes, there's cuts, right? Pure nature, etc. You can name the things that we're going to not agree about, and we've done that for nearly a century. But could we eventually develop this kind of critical interrelation where we can kind of fraternally correct or help one another? Okay, but back to your question, right? Rusty Reno's article. The thing is, he's right because that's true of all of the history of theology, right? Like you can't actually
Yeah.
build a program where we sort of uh, ensure that every 20 years you get a St. Augustine or a Gregory of Nyssa, right? Where we sort of have the perfect kind of curriculum, we have the kind of perfect undergrad that leads to an MTS at Boston College and then goes to a PhD here or there, and therefore you're ensured this kind of perpetuation of the genius theology from here on out. The actual fact is, they always come as a gift, right? Where does an Augustine come from? Where does a Thomas Aquinas come from, right? It's kind of this sort of a great gift to the church. It's a gift to thinking, right? That you have a Thomas Aquinas. And none of the context in which he's in demanded that Thomas Aquinas appears.
That's right.
So the way theology actually works is, yes, you have context, you could say basic standard theology. I want to critique that or nuance that in a moment, that out of which emerges these great figures that then shape and transform theology. But the thing I would probably disagree with Reno, although I have to look back at the actual article, is that's something of a fiction to think that there was this kind of standard theology for
Exactly.
2,000 years that somehow gets disrupted. You could say there's the kind of Roman school kind of manualism here and there that emerges in the 19th century. So I mean, we're nearing a point now where Ressourcement theology has as much of a historical pedigree as does the kind of Thomistic renewal with Leo the 13th. Right? There's a relatively small window of time in which this emerges,
Yeah.
which is not to say it's ephemeral or unimportant, but it's not, the theology of the church for 2,000 years. It's the theology of many parts of the church for a century or so.
Yeah. And believe it or not, even though it's not desirable, it's entirely possible to do brilliant theology without ever once quoting Thomas Aquinas. you know,
In
or
theory.
Balthazar, or Ratzinger, or Augustine. In other words, yeah, revelation is a much bigger category than any particular theologian. God has gifted us with some fantastic, wonderful theologians that we shouldn't do without. I mean, of course, we should read Augustine and Bonaventure and Aquinas, and and on into the modern world. Absolutely, but I agree with you. No, I think the deepest flaw in Reno's argument, and it's not just Reno, others have made that argument as well, is this presumption that there really was this standard theology that everybody was kind of learning. Let's just say in Europe and North America, everybody was learning this standard theology, and that's just the way it is. And that's just not true. If you were a young Franciscan just entering the Franciscan order, you were learning a different theology than what you were learning if you were a Jesuit scholastic,
Sure.
or if you were a Dominican novice. You were all learning different kinds of theology. So the idea that there was this single monolithic standard theology that everybody was agreeing to is simply not true.
And this is where the kind of historical mindset comes into play, right? Is that that's so obviously a product of its time, right? The 19th century is the great age
Yeah.
of homogenization. This is the age of clocks and railroads and standardization of measures of units of measurement, right? This is the age of, that's why you have the theological analogy would be of ultramontanism, right? Let's all sort of do what they do in Rome. right? So let's get rid of the Gallicanism or the local flares of the church in
Yeah.
England or the church in France, and do what is kind of to be ensured as kind of universally valid, which is sort of uh, done by the Pope, right? So you have this kind of ultramontanism simultaneous with the search, the famous book by McCool, The Search for a Unitary Method,
Yeah.
right? That's his book on scholasticism, late scholasticism. And there's something good and pure about that desire, right? To have the Catholic Church speak with one voice in a way. It's in the same way of, there's something
Yeah.
good about having the language of the church be Latin. But again, the actual history of the church shows that that's actually an exception rather than the rule, right? Especially unless we're going to say the Byzantine Catholics, right? The Melkites, the Maronites, they're simply deficient versions of Catholicism because they don't have our historical theological patrimony, our liturgical, right? And that's obviously not the case.
Well, I think that's an extremely important point with regard to Latin, and but we could go down that rabbit hole a long way. But I think I want to bring it back to I want to bring it back to this notion of a standard theology. I'm reminded. Last year I read the memoirs of Joseph Pieper, the great Thomist
Mm.
philosopher Joseph Pieper, and
And
he
good friend with Balthazar, as you know.
oh, that's right. And there was what was interesting to me in his memoirs, where you get to the section where he comes and starts teaching in the United States, and he says that the thing that really struck him was the fact that in American Catholic universities, very, very few of them had theology departments. There
Mm.
were philosophy departments in American Catholic universities, but hardly any theology departments. Theology was taught, according to Pieper anyway, I think he's right, almost exclusively in the seminaries. And then he points out that in the seminaries, there were wildly different forms of theology being taught. So, in a sense, Pieper makes the exact opposite point, all right, that the critics of Ressourcement make. Pieper's complaint is that there really is not any kind of, at least what he saw in the American church, any kind of unifying standard theology. Even he lamented the fact that so many seminarians didn't even read the Summa. They read various digestions of the Summa in this manual or that manual, and the manuals were very different from one another. So it really doesn't paint a picture of this monolithic standard theology that was out there in the American church in particular.
No, yeah, it's maybe a desideratum. It's right. So this goal, right? In some ways, it's the same thing as highly processed foods. I don't know much about nutrition or anything, but let me try another metaphor.
Yeah,
Right? There's something good about the modern food production is that it creates a kind of even guarantee of quality. Right? You're not going to be poisoned by eating Subway, probably. Right? You may be poisoned by eating at a local restaurant, right?
yeah.
Well, immediately the drawbacks, right, is that the highly processed guaranteed quality of Subway or McDonald's also is going to have other serious drawbacks health-wise and
Well,
nutritionally, et
yeah,
cetera, et
like
cetera.
I drink raw goat's milk, and I run a risk by
You do run a
drinking
risk.
raw goat milk. But raw goat milk is better for you than highly processed milk.
There you go. Yeah. And so you see, it would be a good if we could guarantee that all Catholics everywhere have a kind of minimally good homogenized version of Catholic teaching and liturgy. Is it worth the trade-off, though? Right? I mean,
Yeah.
and again, there's not an actual right answer to this, right? The church has always been dealing with this. Trent, getting rid of all liturgies that are not more than 200 years old. Major benefit, right? You have a kind of a standardized
Yeah.
Tridentine liturgy that is in some ways a marked improvement over many local aberrations. Right? There are lots of problematic local liturgies happening in the Middle Ages, and Trent is an improvement upon them. But it may be a detriment to those churches that have very beautiful local liturgies, right? Say perhaps the
And
old
one could
Sarah.
point to seminary education itself. There was all kinds of spotty clerical
Yes,
education
exactly.
before Trent. Trent came in and instituted this massive standardization reform of seminaries.
Exactly. And to great good, right? Sort of it creates
Yeah,
a kind of common watermark. Um, what you would lose, though, say if your seminary formation, so-called seminary before Trent, was you're being trained by Thomas Aquinas, right? Then it would be a
yeah,
lowering, right? Then he would have to teach you the textbook, right? For example, right? This is a
yeah,
silly example, but
yeah.
um, so again. the thing
Yeah.
is that the church is always negotiating these tensions of uniformity, homogeneity versus local diversity. And so clearly the modernist answer of let a thousand flowers bloom, all are equally valid is not correct. But nor is the kind of search for a one and only, because to do so would to be renounce all of theological history prior to that moment.
Yes. And the other problematic, and to go back to the example of Trent, is that so oftentimes standardization in the form of a kind of highly processed, to follow your metaphor, homogenization is a reactive and defensive posture reacting to some kind of a crisis that's out
Yep.
there. So, for example, Trent obviously introduced all kinds of major standardizations that were a great benefit to the church. But why did Trent feel the need to? But the Protestant Reformation had proven that the church was riddled with all kinds of inconsistencies in terms of her clerical formation, in terms of her liturgies, in terms of what people understood doctrines to be, various creedal catechisms floating around out there. So Trent comes in and says, okay, we need to clean this mess up. Standard catechism, standard liturgy, standard seminary formation. Boom. There's our answer to Protestantism. And that worked to a great extent, except that you do lose something in that process, right?
You lose it, and I mean, you could say trend worked because not only did it do that, but it also created the conditions for novelty, like the Jesuits, right? New religious orders, right? So it's
Right.
not a sterile age, right? In fact, what it didn't do is say we are going to freeze at the Middle Ages. We're going to go back. In fact, what it does is go forward in a way, right? It
Yeah.
creates new initiatives in a way to kind of show forth the glories of Catholicism. So you have the beauties of the Baroque age, right? Which has its problems, but also its glories, right? So the real problem is when you have a church that says the dangers before us are so great that we're not going to create conditions by which we could surmount those and outdo them. So you could say, again, this is not an ecumenical thing to say, but it's true historically that Trent is trying to show that Catholicism is way better than Protestantism. That's what, in some ways, what Baroque Catholicism is about. Look how
That's right.
glorious the Jesu is. Look how sort of heroic are the Jesuit missionaries or the Franciscan missionaries.
Yeah.
Um, and it's true to a large extent, right? What you don't want to do is say we can't compete, right? So that's the danger. Say actually we can't compete with in the 16th century Protestantism or in the 20th century
Yeah.
with modern philosophy, with modern thought, with historical critical biblical studies, with
Right.
Heideggerian philosophy, with et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can't compete, and therefore we're actually not going to outdo them. We're going to sort of close in the walls, right?
Yeah.
Bunker down until the storm passes over.
Yeah. And stay in our little insulated world of internal discourse and sort of wait for the rest of the world to self-immolate in its various errors, and we'll come in and pick up the pieces. All right, so let's then move on to the new Ressourcement
Yes.
journal. You've already hinted at one of its purposes, which is the kind of bringing together of sort of Thomistic and sort of Ressourcement thinkers. I mean, yes, Matt Levering, who's like running the show in a sense. This has been Matt's project as long as I've known Matt, going all the way
Mhm.
back to 1997, 98, something like that. Um, so I have two questions for you with regard to that. What is this also the vision of Bishop Barron? I mean, it was this when Bishop was it Barron who came up with the idea of this journal, and if so, what was his animating vision?
Bishop Barron has always been academic, right? He
Oh
taught
yeah,
at Mundelein. In fact, I don't think this is private, but he said at our last conference that, in fact, when he was offered a job here at Catholic University, but instead decided to go forward with Word on Fire. So you could see the kind of divergence in his life in a way. Um, so I think, with this founding of the Word on Fire academic press, which I'm not sure when that started, a few years ago, this kind
yeah,
of
about five
desire,
years ago now, I think four or
is it that
5 years
long?
ago. Yeah,
Okay.
well,
So this
maybe I thought it was like 4 years ago.
this desire to be at service to not only the church and the popular version, which is what he does so well, right, with the Catholicism series and the rest, but to have some kind of ministry or aid to the academic world, to Catholic theology. So it was his idea to come up with a journal. right? So
Yeah.
he said, let's
Okay.
start a journal called the New Ressourcement. And in many ways, you can see his priorities there. He's, one who both loves Aquinas and Balthasar without this kind of interior conflict, at least as far as I can see, right? This kind of sense in which, of course, Balthasar needs Thomas and vice versa. Um, but he sort of commissioned Levering to be the senior editor, and Matthew asked me to be the kind of lead general editor. And we asked together my good friend Father Aaron Pidell, Jesuit, to be the co-editor
Yeah.
with me. And then we assembled the, board of advisors, the associate editors, wrote the mission statement, all the rest.
Ah, very good. It's too bad Lewis Ayres is involved in that. He's such an idiot.
Yes, exactly. He's our one, you can't
I
win them
love
all.
Lewis. I have to bring Lewis's name up in every podcast I do. That's a sort of requirement now. It's because I like to give Lewis a hard time. But I did notice that Lewis is one of the editors, consulting editors, and a brilliant man he is. And the entire list is a list of really brilliant thinkers. And so the bringing together then. I'm looking at the last issue, which has an absolutely marvelous article by John Betts. John Betts
Yes.
is my new hero, by the way, called "The Analogy of Tradition Toward a More Radical Ressourcement." That I think is anybody out there that wants to understand, I think what the new ressourcement is about should read this article by John Betts because I think he really lays it out. But then the next article is this amazing article written by a very, very interesting French thinker, Emmanuel Falck. And then, of course, there's Vincent Strand, who's, he's got an article and so forth. But I want to come back to Emmanuel Falck because what strikes me about and I read his article, which is great. Emmanuel Falck actually, would he even be characterized as a ressourcement thinker? I mean, he likes to color outside the lines. He's kind of
Yes,
a
yes.
phenomenologist, and just he's very difficult to read his books, which are very, very dense, written in that typically French kind of postmodern style of the phenomenologists, and yet he's breathtakingly brilliant and really refreshing. So I want you to comment. I mean, when I saw his name on there, it made me wonder, you know, is part of the project here not simply highlight ressourcement thinkers, strictly speaking, but to throw a broad net out into the broader Catholic intellectual world?
Yeah, I mean, so the following is going to subject me to claims of hubris, and maybe it's true, right? Is that my dream would be for this journal to be kind of the journal of record for Catholic theology and philosophy. Of course,
Yeah.
you can't say such things, and so in fact, I take it back, right? So I'll take it back immediately, right? You can say it's simply a wish, right? So the funny thing about a journal is we have a mission statement, we invite people like yourself, people we want to be associated with us who submit articles. But in
Yeah.
many ways, we're simply waiting for it to emerge, its direction, its future, based on those who submit to us, right? Those who want to be associated with us. And thankfully, so many great people have been, right? Including Emmanuel Falk, including Louis Ayres, and the rest. So,
Yeah.
anyways, it's kind of like this great gift to realize that there is this reception of our project. And in
Yeah.
particular, let me just say one thing about John Betts's article, maybe we'll come back to it, is that, right, it's something like a programmatic article for the journal, right? This is sort of setting out what the journal should be, right? It's
Yeah.
not the editors who wrote this, right? But sort of waiting for people to see, is this something that Catholic theology needs? And I think people like John Betts, Emmanuel, and others are saying this is exactly the kind of journal that's needed right now in
Yeah.
Catholic theology.
Yeah, and I say that, like I said, as a longtime contributor to Communio, and I'm on the editorial board of Communio, and I was very dear friends with the late great David L. Schindler, of course, good friends with his son David C. Schindler, and with the whole JP2 Institute crowd down there near you, right across campus from you. I'm sure you have associations with them all the time as well. Just great, great, great people. And I think Communio obviously will also continue to flourish. I'm going to put you on the spot though and say, well, what's the difference? What's the difference between what you view as the Communio project, which obviously I still believe in passionately, and this project, the new Ressourcement?
Yeah, it's a decisive question. And let me put it a little bit strangely. Creating a journal is not neutral, right? It is going to occupy space that could have gone elsewhere. Scholarship will be published with us that would not be published where it would have been otherwise.
Yeah.
I won't name other names, but there are other journals that if we happen to kill or to paralyze, I would not cry about it. Okay, right? In the process, right? There's, the
Right.
old, there, we're in a particular moment of a lot of changing institutions in Catholic theology at the moment, as you know, at the
Yeah.
university level, at this kind of professional society level, at the journal level, right? There's lots of shifting, there's new movements, there's new organizations. The old ones that have all the power and the resources seem to have lost their way. So in some ways, that's the world in which we're entering. But I would be very sad if we did anything to damage Communio. Right? Communio, I would say,
Yeah.
my hope is we could only strengthen them. And in fact, yeah, I'm very grateful and honored to be. So I was also recently asked to be on the board of advisors or the associate
Cuno,
editors.
communio. Yeah, I saw that.
Yes.
So that's I was cheering that on. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
okay,
So
cross fertilization between the two
exactly.
journals. I think that's great. I mean, in my mind, there are four major journals in the American Catholic world that I hope survive and thrive. The New Ressourcement, Communio, the Thomist, and Nova et Vetera.
All great ones. Yeah.
Those are all four great, fantastic journals that the serve the cause of deep and profound Orthodox Catholic theology that combines fidelity to the magisterium, however, with a deep and profound creativity. All four of those journals are great at that. I can, like you, I could name some other journals that if they met their demise, I wouldn't shed a tear. Let's put it that way. But I hope all four of those journals. So, and I subscribe to all four of those journals.
And let me add a fifth one. It's not Catholic per se, but modern theology. I would say
Oh,
modern
yes,
theology is probably
yes,
that is the journal of record for theology, ecumenically speaking. Right? I would say the its
yeah.
kind of standard is extremely high. So anything there is going to be a very high
Modern
quality.
theology is very good, and then there's a slightly more lowbrow journal than modern theology from the Protestant wing that I used to publish in it from time was is Pro Ecclesia,
Yes, yeah, yeah.
which is a really excellent journal
Yeah.
as well. You
And so
know, and
let me
I
just say a few
go
things
ahead.
about all of those, right? The Thomist and Nova Vedera are clearly aligned with a kind of Thomism, obviously, as one
Right.
of the names indicate, the other being founded by Jornet originally, right? So that's very all to the good, right? To have this powerhouse of Dominican and Thomistic theology in these two journals particularly. And Communio, too, more so than us, is associated with one particular movement, right? And good for them, right? So as I mentioned, we want to be kind of more open to not only ressourcement thinkers, but also Thomists and Franciscans and the whole gamut, and more you could say narrowly um, historical kind of theologians like well, obviously Lewis is not narrow, but someone who does very kind of precise historical work like Lewis Ayres,
Oh
right? So
yeah.
it's so it's not ressourcement for the sake of modern thinking, but kind of what is the origin, what is some of the historical details of an Athanasius or Nicaea. So a bit more historical theology in that sense. Some of the other obvious differences between us and Communio is that not only do they have a kind of brand and the gestalt, kind of in a way, but also, they have a capacity to publish things that aren't all, you could say, double-blind, peer-reviewed academic articles.
Yeah.
And again, this is to their credit, right? They have beautiful kind of poetry and a lot of their translations from the international editions.
I stop there because that's critical. Is that Communio is part of an international movement of journals, all of which have a slightly different identity. One from like the French Communio is very different from the American Communio.
Exactly. But they're different, but also, they'll translate and publish each other. So
Oh yeah, I
it's
mean,
a
they're not
great
at
gift.
odds with one another, but they're
Yeah.
different.
Yeah, but they also publish beautiful spiritual pieces and things that so anyways, they have a kind of range that we don't in that direction. And they also don't have
Yeah.
book reviews, which is just kind of a minor fact, but worth noting.
No, they don't. And yeah, and so Communio I probably has a broader cultural project in
It's
view.
cultural. I think that's the key, right? Is that it's a journal of
Yeah.
theology and culture, right? I think that's the official tagline.
Also, there are also other journals out there. I just recently subscribed to New Polity.
Yeah.
What a great little group of thinkers. New. I'm going to be interviewing Andrew Willard Jones soon on his new upcoming book. I'm interviewing Jacob Imam tomorrow, who is the vice president there at the College of St. Joseph the Worker out in Steubenville, which is associated with the New Polity guys.
Hmm.
There's just the reason why I bring all of this. That there's a lot of doomsaying in the church these days, and there's a lot of negativity to go around. But there's a lot of sap in the tree. There's still a lot of life in that Catholic tree. The American Catholic Church is producing some unbelievably wonderful things right now.
No, I think that's right. I think the weird thing that's going to be has to be negotiated going forward is that often these things are coming not from the old institutions, right? So what do you do with them, right? They don't necessarily all have the same prestige as the old,
Right.
academic institutions and journals had, but they have a vitality and a life that clearly shows that they are the future in a way. So that's going to be something to be negotiated, I think, going forward.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So speaking
No.
theologically, I think there's reasons for great hope in American theology. Where that's going to be, right? If it's in this or that, institution or prestigious journal or not, is in some ways to be determined.
Absolutely. I mean, none of these things are cast in stone, and journals, no matter how successful they are pretty hand-to-mouth operations that are always on the verge of going, especially, print media of all kinds these days is in serious danger of going the way of the dodo bird. Although I have great hope that print media is going to make a comeback. I think there's going to be a backlash. Maybe this is just the old 66-year-old old fogey in me. But you know what? I'm pretty tech savvy in one sense that I read things online. I have blogs I read and I go to various podcasts and so forth. But I tell you what, I keep coming back over and over and over again to books and, books and look at your office there and books. And there's just something I think that a journal like New Ressourcement, people are going to want to have this in their hands and not simply read something online, I think.
Yeah, this is a confession of my own narrow vision. Is um, I thought we would. I told the people at Word on Fire Academic that we needed to print very few of these. I said no one buys journals anymore. People read it through the libraries, through the online databases.
Online,
And we thankfully we do have access now to Atla that should be live pretty soon, so you should be able to get it through all academic searches. But the number of people who have physically subscribed to it is absolutely astounding. Like
that's right.
you
Because
could
you
sort
want
of
that. Like when I subscribed to New Polity, I had the option of just an electronic version only. No, no. I want the paper version. I want the darn thing, the dadgum thing to come in the mail so I can mark it up and give it my own watermark, you know?
exactly. At least for
And,
me too. If I read an article online, it's because I'm searching for that article, right? So
yeah,
then you get a kind of echo chamber. I'll read articles about Balthazar, whoever I want to read about. But if you read a whole issue of a journal, you're going to read all sorts of things that you know nothing about, right? Emmanuel Falk's interpretation of Kierkegaard, right?
yeah,
You might not be looking for that, but then there it is, right? Or this article on Newman on the humanity of the God-man, right?
yeah.
So it's going to expose you to a wider range of theology or philosophy that you may not have got otherwise.
And there's a lot of good theology out there. And hopefully the all these journals we've been mentioning, including New Resource Community and others, are really going to help keep this revolution going because there's a lot of bad theology out there right now, as you well know, Jonathan. A lot of really bad theology. I write about it a lot in my various popular writings, but the fact is, there is a lot of good theology going on out there. You know, there really is.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
we've been at this about an hour now, so we should probably wrap this up. Do you have any last words for the viewers before we sign off for the day?
I don't think so. Anything I should say? maybe, subscribe to the journal, I suppose, is something to say. Subscribe to the journal if you haven't.
Yes, I would and people can just go online. They can type in the new Ressourcement Journal and there'll be a web page and you can go and subscribe.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Okay, so very good. Excellent. Hey, well, thanks for being on the show today, Jonathan. It's always nice to talk with you. Hopefully our paths will cross someday soon.
My pleasure, Larry.
All right. Well, thanks a lot and thanks everyone for listening. Bye now.